There is a nation whose history never quite fit the map. For more than a century, historians believed they understood where the Lakota came from. The story seemed complete, the migration routes made sense, the timelines aligned, the evidence appeared settled. Then researchers began examining something hidden inside ancient remains, and suddenly one detail refused to fit, not because the old story was wrong, but because it was incomplete. To understand why, we first need to understand what we thought we knew. Historians felt confident. The origins of the Great Plains stretch across the heart of North America, a vast ocean of grass that once sustained tens of millions of buffalo. For centuries, this land belonged to the Lakota, the westernmost branch of the Great Sioux Nation. The accepted story was elegant in its logic. The Sioux originated in the woodlands east of the Mississippi. Pressure from neighboring tribes pushed them westward over generations. By the 1700s, they had reached the plains, they acquired horses, they built a civilization around the buffalo, they became one of the most powerful indigenous nations on the continent. The story made sense. Linguists confirmed the connection between Lakota and other Siouan languages. Archaeological sites traced a westward movement. Oral traditions described journeys across water and through forests. Lakota seemed understood. Then researchers looked closer.
There is a nation whose history never quite fit the map. For more than a century, historians believed they understood where the Lakota came from. The story seemed complete. The migration routes made sense. The timelines aligned. The evidence appeared settled. Then researchers began examining something hidden inside ancient remains. And suddenly, one detail refused to fit. Not because the old story was wrong, but because it was incomplete. To understand why, we first need to understand what we thought we knew. The official story. The Great Plains stretch across the heart of North America, a vast ocean of grass that once sustained tens of millions of buffalo. For centuries, this land belonged to the Lakota, the westernmost branch of the Great Sioux Nation. The accepted story was elegant in its logic. The Sioux originated in the woodlands east of the Mississippi. Pressure from neighboring tribes pushed them westward over generations. By the 1700s, they had reached the plains. They acquired horses. They built a civilization around the buffalo. They became one of the most powerful indigenous nations on the continent. The story made sense. Linguists confirmed the connection between Lakota and other Siouan languages. Archaeological sites traced a westward movement. Oral traditions described journeys across water and through forests. Historians felt confident. The origins of the Lakota seemed understood. Then researchers looked closer. The first crack. The problem was not obvious at first. It appeared in the edges of the evidence, in dates that didn't align perfectly, in genetic markers that turned up in places they shouldn't, in archaeological remains that seemed to predate the accepted migration timeline by centuries. The oral traditions spoke of a journey. But how long was that journey truly? How many generations? How many peoples had been absorbed along the way? There was one detail nobody could fully explain. The Lakota showed genetic patterns that did not match a simple eastward to westward migration story. Some markers pointed north, others pointed south. Some pointed toward populations that, according to the official timeline, the Lakota should never have encountered. The evidence worked perfectly until researchers looked closer. Le Suissman, the DNA enters the story. Ancient DNA research arrived slowly in North American archaeology. For decades, indigenous communities raised legitimate concerns about the ethics of studying ancestral remains. Those conversations were necessary. They were also complicated. But as scientific methods improved and collaborative research frameworks developed, some genetic studies began to move forward. What they found did not simplify the story. The DNA confirmed part of the official narrative. There were clear connections to eastern woodland populations. There were genetic signatures consistent with the westward migration that historians had always described. But another part pointed somewhere unexpected. Markers appeared that linked ancient Great Plains populations to groups far older than the Sioux Nation, populations that had inhabited North America not for centuries, but for millennia. Groups that, in some cases, seemed to have no direct linguistic or cultural connection to the Sioux at all. The DNA was telling a different kind of story. Researchers weren't sure yet what kind. The mystery deepens. Then the archaeological evidence began adding new layers. Ancient burial sites across the northern plains revealed skeletal remains that predated Lakota arrival by thousands of years. Some of those remains showed genetic similarities to living Lakota descendants. Others showed connections to populations in the Pacific Northwest. Some appeared related to ancient groups whose descendants are today found in the Arctic. Linguistic scholars had long noted that Siouan languages contained structural anomalies, patterns that didn't descend cleanly from any single ancestral tongue. Some researchers proposed that the Sioux languages had absorbed influences from populations they encountered during migration. Others suggested something more fundamental, that the ancestry of the Lakota was not a single thread but a braid. Migration studies complicated the picture further. Ancient human movement across North America was not the orderly directional process that early historians imagined. People moved in every direction. Populations collapsed and reformed. Groups absorbed one another across centuries of contact. Instead of solving the mystery, the evidence made it larger. Three competing explanations researchers began organizing the conflicting data around three broad theories. Each explained something. None explained everything. The first theory held that the discrepancies were the result of ancient admixture, that the ancestors of the Sioux, long before recorded history, had absorbed remnant populations from earlier waves of migration into North America. The genetic anomalies were real, but they reflected events so distant in time that they carried no cultural memory. The Lakota were still who they appeared to be. They simply carried traces of people who came before. The second theory was more radical. It proposed that the Sioux nation was not a single ancestral group at all, but a confederation that formed gradually, absorbing linguistically and genetically distinct peoples across generations. The Lakota language and identity were real, but the biological ancestry beneath that identity was far more diverse than the tribal structure implied. The nation was built, not born. The third theory argued that the deepest Lakota ancestry traced back to populations that had moved through the Great Plains not once but multiple times, from different directions, in different eras, separated by thousands of years. The plains were not merely a destination, they were a crossroads, and the Lakota were not the inheritors of a single migration, but the living result of every migration that had ever passed through. Each theory explained the DNA patterns in a different way. Each theory left something unexplained. Researchers could not yet determine which one was correct. Some believed all three were partially true. The major study. In the years that followed, a large-scale genomic study attempted to resolve the debate. Researchers analyzed ancient DNA from dozens of burial sites across the northern plains, the Great Lakes region, and the upper Missouri River Valley. They compared those samples against genomic databases representing hundreds of indigenous North American populations. The scope of the project was unlike anything that had come before. The study confirmed the westward migration that historians had always described. The genetic connection between the Lakota and Eastern Siouan-speaking groups was real and measurable, but it also revealed something that surprised the researchers. The data suggested that the Plains populations ancestral to the Lakota had, at some point between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago, absorbed a significant genetic contribution from a separate source population, one that appeared related to ancient peoples of the Pacific Rim Migration Corridor. A population that had entered North America, not from the east but from the west. Not in the era of the Sioux Nation, but in a period so ancient it predates every oral tradition currently known. The results surprised the researchers. The data suggested something larger than any single group's origin story. It suggested that the deepest layers of Lakota ancestry were not Siouan at all, but belonged to people whose names have never been recorded, whose languages vanished thousands of years before contact, and whose existence was only now becoming visible inside the structure of living and ancient DNA. The paradox. This is where the evidence became genuinely strange. The more DNA scientists studied, the less simple the story became. Every answer generated new questions. Every confirmed connection revealed an unexpected layer beneath it. The Lakota were connected to the eastern woodlands. That was confirmed. They were also connected, at deeper levels, to ancient populations whose origins lay far from the Great Plains. The genetic evidence was coherent. It simply refused to be simple, and this created a paradox that researchers are still working through. The clearer the evidence became, the more complicated the past appeared. Science had expected to find a single origin. Instead, it found a palimpsest, a document written over and over by different hands across thousands of years, in which every new inscription preserved traces of what came before. What does it mean for a people's identity when the biological roots of that identity reach further back than the culture itself? What is ancestry when the people who contributed to your genome lived 10,000 years before anyone who shared your language, your stories, or your name? There was no clean answer. Mitakuye Oyasing, the Lakota, themselves had always understood something that Western science was only beginning to articulate. Mitakuye Oyasing, all my relations. This phrase, among the most sacred in Lakota spiritual practice, expresses a worldview in which every living being is connected, not metaphorically, but fundamentally. Human beings are not separate from the land, from the animals, from one another, or from those who came before. Existence is not a collection of isolated individuals. It is a web of relations that extends backward and forward through time without limit. When Lakota elders spoke of their ancestors, they did not speak only of their grandparents or great-grandparents. They spoke of a continuity so deep it could not be measured in generations. The land remembered. The people remembered. The relationship between them had always been larger than any single story could contain. What the DNA was now revealing was not a contradiction of this worldview. It was, in some ways, its scientific confirmation. The roots of the Lakota people reached backward through time, through populations and migrations and moments of connection that no living person could remember, through peoples who had crossed ancient landscapes, survived ancient extinctions, and left their mark inside the bodies of people who would one day call themselves Lakota. All my relations, the science and the philosophy were perhaps pointing toward the same truth. The bigger human story. The Lakota story is not unique. Every human population on Earth carries within its genome the traces of peoples who no longer exist as distinct groups, ancient migrations, forgotten confederations, populations absorbed and transformed across millennia. The story of human ancestry, examined closely enough, always turns out to be more tangled, more vast, and more surprising than the story any single culture tells about itself. Modern Europeans carry DNA from ancient steppe populations who swept across the continent 5,000 years ago, absorbing and displacing the farmers and foragers who came before. Modern South Asians carry layers of ancestry from migrations separated by tens of thousands of years. The indigenous peoples of the Americas descend from at least 3 distinct founding populations, possibly more, whose movements and interactions shaped every nation on the continent. Identity is real. Culture is real, language is real, history is real. And yet beneath all of it, the biological record tells a story of connection so profound that the boundaries between peoples begin to seem less like walls and more like lines drawn in water. What we call a nation is always, at some level, the visible surface of a much older process. The process of human beings moving, meeting, surviving, and becoming something new together. The Lakota were never separate from that process. Neither was anyone else. What the evidence finally revealed. The Lakota were never who we thought they were, not because the old story was false, because it was too small. For generations, historians drew a line from the eastern woodlands to the Great Plains and called it an origin. The line was real, but it was only the last chapter of a story that began long before anyone thought to ask where it started. Ancient DNA did not erase Lakota history. It expanded it. It reached past the migrations of the Sioux Nation, past the formation of the Plains culture, past the adoption of the horse, past every era that oral tradition could name, and found, at the bottom of the record, the traces of people who crossed ancient landscapes in a world that no longer exists. The roots reached further back than anyone imagined. Not one migration, many migrations, not one people absorbed into another. Many peoples across thousands of years, becoming something that would eventually call itself Lakota, and look out across the Great Plains and know, in a way that required no laboratory to confirm, that this land was home. The mystery was not solved. It became larger. And perhaps that is exactly what the evidence was always trying to say, that the human story is never as finished as we believe it to be, that every answer is also a door, that the past examined honestly, does not give us closure, it gives us wonder.